Some losses cut so deep they steal your voice forever. For 16 years, Josiah Brandt hadn't spoken a single word since the night he buried his wife and baby son in the frozen Wyoming ground. The mountain man lived alone in his cabin, trading pelts in town with nothing but nods and pointing. Folks said grief had broken something inside him that couldn't be fixed. Then came Ellie Mae Bishop, a poor widow running from trouble. She showed up at his door needing shelter, her boot torn and her hope nearly gone. When she saw the old bed in the corner, still made up like his wife might return, she asked him straight, "Is your bed still empty?" Those 5 simple words cracked open 16 years of silence. What happened next would change both their lives. But can 2 broken hearts really heal each other in the middle of nowhere? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pine trees like a morning song, the same tune it had played for 16 years around Josiah Brandt's cabin. Perched on a rocky ledge 8,000 feet above the Wyoming territory, the small log structure seemed to grow from the mountain itself, weathered gray wood blending with granite outcroppings, moss creeping up the north-facing walls where the sun never touched dot inside. Josiah moved through his morning ritual with the precision of a man who had reduced life to its essential elements. Water from the spring behind the cabin, coffee beans ground by hand in the wooden mill his father had carved 40 years ago, bacon from the smokehouse, eggs from the 3 hens he kept in a coop built against the cabin's south wall. Every movement deliberate, economical, silent. The worn leather trading ledger sat open on his rough-hewn table, pages filled with requests written in other people's handwriting. Need medicine for Mary's cough. Will trade 2 chickens. Want knife sharpened. Fresh bread. Horse through shoe can you fix? Have silver dollar. For 16 years, the people of Cedar Falls had written their needs in that book, and Josiah had responded with nods or pointing, never once opening his mouth to speak. His calloused fingers traced the edge of Sarah's wedding ring, hanging from a leather cord around his neck. Even after all these years, the gold band caught the firelight, casting tiny dancing shadows on his flannel shirt. He'd taken it from her finger that terrible night in 1867, when the midwife had shaken her head and whispered words that shattered his world. "I'm sorry, Josiah. Neither of them made it." Sarah Elizabeth Brandt, née Morrison, had been 22 years old, with hair the color of autumn wheat and a laugh that could chase away the darkest winter day. She'd followed him from Pennsylvania to this wild territory with nothing but trust in her heart and dreams of raising a family in the clean mountain air. The cabin they'd built together was supposed to echo with children's voices, to smell of baking bread and Christmas pine, to be filled with the warm chaos of a growing family. Instead, it had become a shrine to silence. Josiah pulled on his heavy coat and stepped onto the covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the cabin. The view stretched for miles, rolling peaks, painted purple in the dawnlight, valleys thick with aspen and pine, and far below, the silver thread of the Sweetwater River winding toward distant plains. It was beautiful enough to break a man's heart, which was exactly what it had done to him every morning for 16 years. Down in Cedar Falls, the town was waking up. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and he could just make out the tiny figures of people beginning their day. Once a month, he made the 3-hour trek down the winding mountain path, his pack horse loaded with pelts, dried herbs, and the occasional piece of furniture he'd crafted during the long winter evenings. He'd trade for supplies, collect requests in his ledger, and return to his mountain before the sun reached its peak. The townspeople had long ago stopped trying to make him talk. Dr. Patterson, who delivered the stillborn baby, had explained it to anyone who'd listen. Sometimes grief breaks a man's voice box same as it breaks his heart. Josiah's words are buried up there on the mountain with his family. But this morning was different. As Josiah fed his chickens and checked the small garden where he grew potatoes and beans, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The mountain air itself seemed to hold a different quality, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when every living thing holds its breath. 50 miles away, Ellie Mae Bishop was learning just how wrong a person could be about their own life. She sat in the back of a freight wagon, clutching her small cloth bag and trying not to cry as the driver explained the situation with the matter-of-fact cruelty of a man who'd seen too much suffering to be moved by one more widow's tears. "Harlan, Cobb don't give up easy," the driver said, not taking his eyes off the rutted road. "Once he gets his teeth in you, he's like a wolf with a bone. Your husband owed him money, and now you owe him money, and he'll follow you to hell and back to collect it." Ellie Mae had thought she could escape to her sister's place in California, but Cobb had found her in Denver, then again in Fort Collins. Each time, she'd managed to slip away with nothing more than the clothes on her back and what little money she could scrape together. Now she was down to her last few dollars. Her right boot was splitting at the sole, and winter was coming too. "The high country, where exactly are you taking me?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Far as the wagon goes is Cedar Falls. After that, you're on your own. But I'll tell you something, lady. You want to disappear. The mountains above that town are about as disappeared as a person can get. A lot of folks gone up there over the years, never come back down." The description should have terrified her, but instead, Ellie Mae felt something like hope stirring in her chest. At 28, she'd already buried one husband and lost the small farm they'd worked together in Kansas. Thomas Bishop had been a good man, but weak with money and weaker still when it came to standing up to men like Harlan Cobb. He borrowed money to buy seed for their wheat crop, then borrowed more when the harvest failed, then borrowed against the farm itself when he couldn't pay the interest. When Thomas died of pneumonia the previous spring, Ellie Mae had discovered just how deep in debt they'd fallen. Cobb had given her 2 weeks to come up with $800 more money than she'd seen in her entire life. When she couldn't pay, he'd made it clear that there were other ways for a young widow to work off her debt, ways that made her skin crawl and her stomach turn dot so she'd run. Sold everything she owned, took the train as far as her money would carry her, then hitched rides on freight wagons and farm carts, always moving west, always looking over her shoulder. But Cobb had connections everywhere, men who owed him favors or feared his reputation. He tracked her across 3 states like a bloodhound, and she was running out of places to hide. The wagon creaked and swayed over the rough mountain road, and Ellie Mae pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The air was getting colder as they climbed, and she could see snow on the distant peaks. She'd grown up in Kansas, where winter meant cold wind and frozen mud, not the bone-deep chill that seemed to seep from these ancient mountains. "Tell me about this Cedar Falls," she said to the driver. "Not much to tell. Maybe 200 people on a good day. Got a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a church that sees more use as a meeting hall than a house of worship. Mining town, mostly, though the good claims are all played out. Folks there are friendly enough, but they mind their own business. Mountain folk are like that. And above the town?" The driver glanced back at her with something like pity in his weathered face. "That's wild country, lady. Bears, wolves, weather. That can kill you if you don't know what you're doing. There's a few old prospectors still working claims up there, couple of trappers, maybe a hermit or two. But it ain't no place for a woman alone, especially not with winter coming." But as the wagon rounded a bend and Cedar Falls came into view, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a single main street, with the vast wilderness rising like a wall behind it, Ellie Mae felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The town looked like the edge of the world, the last place civilization could gain a foothold before the mountains took over completely. "This is perfect," she whispered. and meant it. The driver helped her down from the wagon and wished her luck with the gruff kindness of a man who expected never to see her again. Ellie Mae stood in the dusty street, her split boot letting in the cold, her bag containing everything she owned in the world, and felt more hopeful than she had since Thomas died. She had no way of knowing that 40 miles away, higher up the mountain than most people ever ventured, a silent man was about to have his carefully ordered world turned upside down by a simple question about an empty bed. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, when Ellie Mae finally admitted to herself that she was lost. She'd left Cedar Falls that morning with vague directions to follow the creek upstream until you find something. But the creek had split into 3 smaller streams, and she'd chosen wrong. Now she was stumbling through dense pine forest as darkness fell, her split boot making every step painful. Her thin shawl no match for the mountain cold. She was on the verge of panic when she saw the glow through the trees. At first, she thought it might be a campfire, but as she pushed through the undergrowth, she realized it was lamplight coming from windows. A cabin, solid and real, with smoke rising from its chimney and the warm promise of shelter. Ellie Mae stood at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain. What if whoever lived here didn't welcome strangers? What if they were dangerous? But then a gust of wind cut through her shawl like a knife, and she realized she didn't have a choice. It was this cabin or freezing to death in the forest. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, her knuckles barely making a sound against the solid planks. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard footsteps inside, slow and deliberate. The door opened, and she found herself looking up at the tallest, most weathered man she'd ever seen. Josiah Brandt stood in his doorway, lamplight behind him creating a silhouette that seemed carved from the mountain itself. His dark hair was shot through with gray, his beard neatly trimmed but showing the same silver threads. His eyes, deep brown and sad as winter, took in her torn clothing, her split boot, her obvious exhaustion. He didn't speak, didn't ask who she was or what she wanted, just stepped aside and gestured her into the warmth of his cabin. "Thank you," Ellie Mae whispered, stepping across the threshold into a world that smelled of wood smoke and loneliness. "I'm Ellie Mae Bishop, and I think I might be lost." Josiah closed the door behind her and pointed to a chair by the fire. Then he moved to the stove and began preparing coffee, his movements efficient and practiced. On the table, she noticed a leather-bound book lying open, pages covered with different HANDWRITNGs. As the warmth of the cabin began to thaw her frozen bones, Ellie Mae looked around the single room that was clearly a man's domain. Everything was neat and purposeful, tools hanging from pegs, books stacked precisely on shelves, dishes clean and put away. But there was something else, something that made her heart ache with recognition. In the corner, pushed against the far wall, stood a bed made up with obvious care. The quilt was faded but clean, the pillow still holding the indent of a head that had last rested there long ago. It was the bed of someone who was never coming back, preserved like a shrine to memory. Ellie Mae had lived with that kind of loss. She understood the way grief could turn everyday objects into sacred relics, the way a person could build their entire life around the shape of an absence. When Josiah handed her a cup of hot coffee and she saw the gentleness in his weathered hands, she knew she'd found someone who understood what it meant to have your heart broken beyond repair. "Is your bed still empty?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Josiah went perfectly still, the coffee cup halfway to his lips. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their eyes met across the small cabin, and Ellie Mae saw something crack open in his face: surprise, pain, and something else she couldn't quite name. Then he nodded, just once, and she knew her life had just taken a turn she never could have imagined. 3 days passed like a gentle dream Ellie Mae was afraid to wake from. Josiah had given her blankets and made a bed by the fire, respecting the sanctity of the corner where his wife's memory lived. He'd mended her boot with careful stitches and leather patches, working by lamplight while she slept. Each morning, he prepared breakfast for two without being asked, setting her plate across from his at the small wooden table. They existed in a world of gestures and glances, of nods and the occasional written word when something needed explaining. Josiah would point to the coffee pot with raised eyebrows more. She would shake her head and smile no. Thank you. He would gesture toward the door when he went to tend his animals, an invitation to come along if she wished. She would follow, learning the rhythm of his mountain life. On the third morning, Ellie Mae woke to find her boots sitting by the fire, perfectly mended and oiled to a warm brown shine. Beside it lay a note in Josiah's careful handwriting. Should. Last you many miles now. The implication hit her like cold water. He expected her to leave. She found him outside, splitting firewood with the methodical precision of a man who'd been doing it for decades. Each swing of the axe was perfectly controlled, the wood falling into neat halves that he stacked with mathematical precision. When he saw her watching, he paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the morning chill. "Thank you for fixing my boot," she said, holding up the mended footwear. "It's beautiful work." He nodded once and returned to his splitting, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped the axe handle just a little too tight. He was waiting for her to say goodbye, to thank him for his kindness and disappear back down the mountain to whatever life awaited her in the world below. Instead, she sat down on a nearby stump and watched him work. After a few minutes, he stopped again, leaning on the axe handle and giving her a questioning look. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said simply. "Not really." Josiah's weathered face showed a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or concern. He set down the axe and walked to the cabin, returning with his trading ledger and a pencil. He wrote something and showed it to her. "What about family? My sister lives in California, but I can't reach her. The man who's hunting me, he has people watching the train stations, the stage lines. He'll find me before I get halfway there." More writing. What man? Ellie Mae looked out at the vast wilderness surrounding them, at the peaks that rose like a fortress wall between this cabin and the world below. For 3 days, she'd felt safe here, protected by distance and silence. Now she had to decide whether to trust this gentle giant with the truth. His name is Harlan Cobb. He's what people call a debt collector, but he's really just a criminal with a badge he bought somewhere. My husband owed him money when he died, and now he says I owe it. $800. She laughed bitterly. I've never seen that much money in my life. Josiah wrote again. How much you got? $3 and some change. Enough for maybe a week's food if I'm careful. He stared at the number for a long moment, then looked up at her with those deep brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. She saw him make a decision, watched it happen in the set of his jaw and the straightening of his shoulders. He tore a fresh page from the ledger and wrote more carefully this time. Winter comes early up here. Dangerous to travel alone. You can stay until spring if you help with chores. Ellie Mae felt tears spring to her eyes. You don't even know me. I could be a thief, or worse. Josiah smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and shook his head. He wrote, Thieves don't mend socks. Then he pointed to where she'd quietly darned a hole in one of his wool socks the evening before, thinking he hadn't noticed. You saw that? He nodded and wrote again. Good hands. Gentle heart. Mountain needs gentle hearts. The kindness in those simple words broke something open in Ellie Mae's chest. She'd been running for so long, afraid and alone, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something other than a problem to be solved, or a debt to be collected. I can cook, she said, and clean, and help with the animals. I'm stronger than I look. Josiah gestured toward the woodpile and handed her a smaller axe. "Show me." For the next hour, they worked side by side, splitting and stacking wood for the winter ahead. Ellie Mae's hands blistered and her back ached, but she kept pace with him, matching his steady rhythm. When they finished, he looked at the neat stacks they'd created together and nodded his approval. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Josiah pulled out the ledger again and wrote a longer message. "Rules for winter. We share work, share food, share fire. You sleep by hearth, I sleep in loft. We don't talk about past unless we want to. Spring comes, you decide what happens next." Ellie Mae read it twice, understanding that he was offering her more than shelter. He was offering her time to heal, time to think, time to become someone other than a woman running from debts she'd never incurred. "What if he finds me here?" she asked. Josiah's expression darkened, and he wrote with more force than before. "Won't happen. Mountain protects its own." She wanted to believe him, but she'd underestimated Harlan Cobb before. "You don't know this. Man, he's dangerous, and he has connections everywhere. If he traces me here." Josiah stood abruptly and walked to a wooden chest in the corner. He returned with a crumpled piece of paper, a wanted notice with her name and description, offering a $50 reward for information about her whereabouts. Ellie Mae's blood went cold. "Where did you get this?" He wrote, "Came to town last week. Store owner showed me. Asked if I'd seen you." "What did you tell them?" Instead of writing, Josiah made a gesture she'd seen him use in town, a simple shrug, hands turned up, eyebrows raised. The universal mountain expression for haven't seen nothing, don't know nothing, mind my own business. "But now you do know," she said. "You're harboring a fugitive." Josiah took the wanted notice and walked to the fireplace. He held it up, looked at her for permission, and when she nodded, he tossed it into the flames. They watched it curl and blacken, her name disappearing in smoke and ash. Then he wrote one more line in the ledger, his handwriting bold and certain. "Ellie Mae Bishop died on the mountain road. Ellie Mae Brandt, helping me with winter chores." She stared at the new name, at the way he'd written it, like a promise, like a prayer, like a new beginning scratched into existence with pencil and hope. "You can't just give me your name," she whispered. He wrote back, "Name's just letters. Person wearing it makes it mean something." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter was coming, whether they were ready or not. In a few months, snow would block the mountain passes and cut them off from the world below completely. They would be alone together in this cabin, two damaged souls trying to heal in the shelter of each other's company. Ellie Mae looked around the small space that would be her home for the next several months. The careful order, the evidence of solitary years, the empty bed in the corner. She thought about the man who'd built this sanctuary from grief and silence, who just offered to share his name with a stranger because she needed somewhere to belong. "Ellie Mae Brandt," she said aloud, testing the sound of it. Josiah nodded and wrote one final message before closing the ledger for the night. "Welcome home." As they settled into their respective sleeping areas, Ellie Mae pulling her blankets close to the fire while Josiah climbed the ladder to his loft, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died, the possibility of a future that wasn't built on running away from the past, but 40 miles down the mountain. In the saloon at Cedar Falls, Harlan Cobb was buying drinks for anyone who'd listen to his questions about a missing widow, and his pale eyes held the patient hunger of a predator who'd found fresh tracks in new territory. The first snow came early that year, dusting the peaks with white while the valleys still held onto autumn's golden light. Ellie Mae woke to find Josiah already up, standing at the window with his coffee cup, watching the flakes drift down like feathers from a torn pillow. "Beautiful," she said softly, joining him at the window. He nodded and pointed to the higher ridges, where the snow was falling heavier. Then he held up 2 fingers and pointed to himself, indicating he'd seen this pattern many times before. The message was clear. Winter was coming fast, and they needed to prepare. Over the next week, they fell into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Ellie Mae had always been capable. Farm life had taught her that, but there was something different about working alongside Josiah. He never rushed her or took over when she struggled with an unfamiliar task. Instead, he would demonstrate once, clearly and patiently, then step back and let her find her own way. When she discovered Sarah's recipe book tucked behind the flour tin, she expected him to snatch it away, to guard his dead wife's memory like a jealous dragon. Instead, he watched her run her fingers over the careful handwriting. Sarah's cornbread, Mother's apple butter, Sunday chicken and dumplings, and simply nodded when she looked up at him questioningly. "May I?" she asked, holding up the book. He wrote in his ledger she would want her recipes used. That afternoon, Ellie Mae made Sarah's cornbread, following instructions written in fading ink 16 years earlier. The kitchen filled with the smell of baking, and she watched Josiah's face as he recognized something from his past made new again. When she cut him a piece, still warm from the oven, he closed his eyes as he tasted it. "Is it right?" she asked anxiously. He opened his eyes, and she saw something there she hadn't seen before. Not quite happiness, but a softening around the edges of his perpetual sadness. He wrote, "Just like she made it. Thank you." They began to communicate in ways that went beyond words or writing. A raised eyebrow meant, "Are you warm enough?" A gesture toward the woodpile meant, "I'll handle that." A hand on her shoulder when she struggled with the heavy water buckets meant, "Let me help." They developed their own language of looks and movements, understanding each other with an intimacy that surprised them both. Ellie Mae learned that Josiah woke before dawn every morning and stood on the porch for exactly 10 minutes, no matter the weather, drinking his first cup of coffee while he watched the sun touch the peaks. She learned that he carved small wooden animals in the evenings, his hands sure and gentle as he shaped bears and deer and eagles from pieces of pine. She learned that he read voraciously Shakespeare and Dickens, but also botanical guides and almanacs, feeding a mind that had been too long deprived of conversation. In return, she showed him small courtesies he'd forgotten existed. She mended his clothes without being asked, adding neat patches where his shirts had worn thin. She organized his bookshelf by subject, creating sections for literature, practical guides, and what she privately called Josiah's philosophy books, volumes of Emerson and Thoreau that were soft with handling. She made curtains from flour, sacks, adding touches of warmth to windows that had been bare for 16 years. One evening, as she worked on embroidering simple flowers along the curtain edges, Josiah wrote in his ledger and showed her, "Why do you do these things?" She looked up from her needlework, considering the question. "Because a home should feel cared for. Because small beauties matter. Because you've been kind to me, and kindness should be returned." He wrote again, "More than kindness." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Ellie Mae felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she focused intently on her embroidery. "I don't know what you mean." But she did know, and so did he. In the quiet evenings by the fire, when she would look up from her sewing to find him watching her, or when their hands would brush as they passed dishes at supper, there was something growing between them that had nothing to do with practical arrangements or mountain hospitality. Josiah wrote, "Sarah used to embroider flowers, different ones." He paused, seeming to gather courage, then added, "Yours are prettier." The compliment was so unexpected, so gently offered, that Ellie Mae felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. That means more than you know." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the soft whisper of her needle through fabric. Outside, the wind was picking up, and they could hear the first real storm of the season beginning to gather strength. "Tell me about her," Ellie Mae said suddenly. "About Sarah, if you want to." Josiah set down the wooden eagle he'd been carving and looked toward the empty bed in the corner. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't respond. Then he picked up his pencil and began to write, more words than she'd ever seen him put on paper at once. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, born in Pittsburgh. Father was a preacher, mother played piano. She had yellow hair that curled when it rained and hands that could make anything grow. Followed me west because she said love was the greatest. Adventure. Died trying to give me a son. Both of them gone in one night. Doctor said sometimes these things happen. No reason, no blame, just loss. Ellie Mae read the words twice, feeling the weight of 16 years of grief condensed into those simple sentences. What was she like? Her personality, I mean. More writing? Laughed at everything. Made friends with strangers. Sang while she worked. Never met a problem she didn't think we could solve together. Opposite of me in every way that mattered. And the baby? Boy, going to name him James after my father. Had it all planned cradle by our bed. Toys I would carve. Stories I would tell him. Built dreams around someone I never got to meet. Ellie Mae set down her embroidery and moved to sit beside him on the bench. Without thinking, she placed her hand over his, feeling the calluses and scars. The strength that had been tempered by years of solitary work. "I'm sorry," she said, "for your loss, for all of it." Josiah looked down at their joined hands, and she felt him tremble slightly. It occurred to her that he probably hadn't been touched by another person in 16 years, hadn't felt the simple comfort of human contact since the night he'd held his dying wife. Slowly, carefully, he turned his hand palm up beneath hers, letting their fingers intertwine. His skin was warm and rough, alive in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Tell me about Thomas," he wrote with his free hand, the pencil awkward in his left grip. "He was a good man," she said, not moving her hand away. "Gentle, hard-working, honest to a fault. Maybe too honest for his own good. He trusted people who didn't deserve it, believed the best of everyone, even when experience should have taught him better. You loved him." "Yes, but it was a quiet love, like a steady fire that keeps you warm without burning bright. Nothing like—" She stopped herself, realizing where that thought was leading. "Nothing like what?" He wrote. She looked at their intertwined hands, at his face in the firelight, at the question in his eyes that went deeper than words could reach. "Nothing like this," she whispered, and felt the world change around them. The storm that had been threatening finally arrived 3 days later, howling down from the high peaks with a fury that made the cabin walls shake. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind drove through every crack and crevice, making the fire dance wildly in the stone hearth. Ellie Mae woke in the gray pre-dawn to find Josiah already dressed, pulling on his heavy coat and gloves. She sat up in her blankets, instantly alert. "Where are you going in this weather?" she asked. He pointed to the door, then made a gesture she'd learned meant the animals, his 3 chickens, the milk cow, and the old pack horse that had carried his goods to town for a decade. "I'll come with you," she said, reaching for her own coat. Josiah shook his head firmly and pointed back to the fire. The message was clear. "Too dangerous. Stay warm. I'll handle it." But Ellie Mae had grown up on a farm, and she knew that caring for animals in a blizzard was work for 2 people, not 1. She pulled on her boots, the ones he'd mended so carefully, and stood up with the kind of determination he was beginning to recognize. "We're partners in this," she said simply. "Partners. Don't let each other face the storm alone." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. He wrote quickly in his ledger. "Dangerous. Could get lost between here and barn." "Then we'll tie a rope," she said, already pulling twine from his supply box. "My father taught me that trick." Storm like this, you always keep one hand on the guideline. Josiah watched her secure one end of the rope to the door handle, testing the knot with the expertise of someone who understood that small details could mean the difference between life and death. When he nodded his approval, she felt a warm glow of pride that had nothing to do with the fire. They made their way to the small barn through snow that was already knee-deep, the rope their only connection to safety in the whirling white chaos. Inside the shelter, the animals were huddled together, nervous but unharmed. Josiah milked the cow while Ellie Mae gathered eggs and spread fresh straw, working with the efficient teamwork they developed over the past weeks. When they returned to the cabin, breathless and covered in snow, Josiah caught her hand as she started to remove her coat. He looked at her for a long moment, snow melting in his dark hair, his eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he wrote in the ledger, "Thank you. Been doing that alone for 16 years. Forgot what it felt like to have help." "You don't have to do anything alone anymore," she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. Over the next few days, trapped inside by the continuing storm, they discovered new layers to their growing connection. Josiah showed her his collection of hand-carved animals, explaining through gestures and brief notes how he'd started making them the first winter after Sarah died, needing something to occupy his hands during the endless dark hours. Among the wooden creatures, Ellie Mae found something that made her breath catch: a tiny horse, no bigger than her thumb, carved with exquisite detail. Every line of the miniature mane was perfect, every hoof precisely shaped. But it was unfinished, the wood still rough in places, as if the carver had stopped mid-creation. "This one's different," she said, holding it up. Josiah's face went very still. He took the little horse from her hands and stared at it for a long moment before writing, "Started it for the baby. Never finished." The words hit her like a physical blow. She could picture him 16 years ago, full of hope and plans, carving toys for a child who would never play with them. The unfinished horse was more than just a piece of wood. It was a dream interrupted, a future that had died before it could begin. "May I finish it?" she asked softly. Josiah's eyes widened in surprise. He looked from her face to the little horse and back again, as if trying to understand what she was offering. "I'm not trying to replace anything," she said quickly. "I just think beautiful things shouldn't stay unfinished, even if they end up meaning something different than what was originally planned." After what felt like an eternity, he placed the tiny horse back in her palm and nodded Dodd for the rest of that day. While the storm raged outside, Ellie Mae worked on the little carving. She'd helped her father with woodworking when she was young, and her hands remembered the feel of the tools, the way to work with the grain instead of against it. Josiah watched her, occasionally offering a different knife or pointing out a detail she'd missed, but mostly just observing as 16 years of unfinished hope took shape under her careful fingers. When she finally set down the tools, the little horse was complete, every detail perfect, every surface smooth as silk. It stood in her palm like a tiny miracle, seeming almost ready to gallop away. "It's beautiful," Josiah wrote. "Thank you. What should we do with it?" He considered this for a long moment, then wrote, "Give it to someone who needs to believe in new beginnings." That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing Sarah's recipe for beef stew, Ellie Mae felt the walls between them shifting in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. The storm had forced an intimacy that went beyond their careful politeness, beyond the safe boundaries they'd established. When Josiah reached across the table to refill her coffee cup, their hands brushed, and this time neither of them pulled away. The contact was electric, sending warmth racing up her arm and straight to her heart. "Josiah," she said softly, and he looked up at the sound of his name on her lips. She'd been saying it more often lately, as if testing its weight, its familiarity. "Hey," wrote, "what is it? I need you to know something. Whatever this is between us, It's not because I'm grateful for shelter, or because I'm lonely, or because you're the only man around. It's because of who you are. The way you see things, the way you care for everything in your world. The way you make me feel safe without making me feel small. Josiah set down his pencil, his hands trembling slightly. When he looked at her, she saw 17 years of loneliness and loss, but also something newer hope. Fragile as spring ice, but unmistakably real dots slowly, as if afraid she might disappear. He reached across the table and cupped her face in his rough palm. His thumb traced the line of her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, closing her eyes at the tenderness of it. When she opened them again, he was writing with his free hand. Scared. Of what? Of wanting this, of losing it, of not being enough. Ellie Mae covered his hand with hers, holding it against her cheek. You're more than enough. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for. The storm chose that moment to rattle the windows again, reminding them both of the world beyond their small circle of warmth and light. But for the first time since she'd arrived, the sound didn't make Ellie Mae think of danger or cold, or the long winter ahead. It made her think of sanctuary. The morning Ellie Mae discovered the graves. She'd been following what she thought was a deer trail through the aspens behind the cabin. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and bright, and she'd wanted to explore the boundaries of what she was starting to think of as home. She was looking for wild herbs. Josiah had shown her drawings in one of his books of plants that could be dried for winter medicine. When she stumbled into a small clearing she'd never seen before. 2 wooden crosses stood side by side in the snow, their surfaces weathered gray, but still bearing the careful carving that spoke of loving hands and patient hours. Sarah Elizabeth Brandt, beloved wife. James Thomas Brandt, our son. The dates told the story. Sarah had lived 22 years, 3 months, and 16 days. James had lived less than an hour. Ellie Mae sank to her knees in the snow, understanding finally why Josiah had chosen this particular spot for his cabin, why he'd never left the mountain, why silence had seemed like the only reasonable response to such devastation. He'd built his home close enough to visit them every day, far enough to find some peace. This wasn't just where he lived, it was where he kept vigil. She was still kneeling there, snow soaking through her skirts, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Josiah standing at the edge of the clearing, his face a mask of fury and pain that made her heart stop. For 16 years, this place had been his alone. Private grief, private ritual, private conversation with the dead. Now she'd violated the most sacred space in his carefully ordered world, and the expression on his face told her exactly how deep that violation cut. Josiah, I'm sorry, she began, starting to rise. I didn't know, but he was already turning away, his shoulders rigid with rage. She heard him crashing through the brush, heading back toward the cabin with long, angry strides that spoke of betrayal and boundaries crossed beyond repair. By the time she made it back to the cabin, he was throwing her few possessions into her cloth bag with sharp, violent movements. The message was unmistakable. Pack up, get out. Find somewhere else to heal your broken heart, because you've just shattered mine all over again. Please, she said, watching him stuff her mended stockings into the bag with unnecessary force. Let me explain. He spun to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, not just anger, but a kind of wild desperation, like an animal caught in a trap. He grabbed his ledger and wrote with such force that the pencil tip broke. That place is mine, not yours, never yours. I know that, she said quietly. I wasn't trying to intrude. I was looking for herbs, and I got turned around, and I just stumbled across it. I would never have gone there on purpose. But he was already writing again. You don't understand. No one understands. She was everything. Everything. And now she's gone, and you're here, and it's wrong. All wrong. The words hit her like physical blows, but underneath his rage, she heard something else: fear. Fear that caring for someone new meant betraying someone lost. Fear that healing meant forgetting. Fear that love could be used up, that there wasn't enough in his heart for both the dead and the living. "You think I'm trying to replace her," Ellie Mae said, and it wasn't a question. "Aren't you?" he wrote, the letters jagged and angry. "No." She sat down at the table, forcing herself to be calm even though her heart was racing. "I'm trying to love you. Just you. Not as a replacement for anyone. Not as a way to fill an empty space. I'm trying to love the man who carved toys for a son he never got to hold, who visits graves in the snow, who's kept faith with people who can't answer back." "That's not wrong, Josiah. That's beautiful." He stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling like he'd been running. Then he wrote, more carefully this time, "What do you know about loss?" The question opened something in Ellie Mae's chest, something she'd kept locked away since Thomas died. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love. I know what it's like to feel guilty for being the one who survived. I know what it's like to wonder if you'll ever be able to care about anything again without feeling like you're being unfaithful to the dead." She paused, gathering courage for the hardest part. "And I know what it's like to realize that the dead don't want us to stop living. They want us to carry them with us while we keep moving forward." Josiah's hand stilled on the pencil. He looked toward the window in the direction of the hidden clearing, and she saw his face cycle through a dozen different emotions. "Thomas used to say that love isn't a pie," she continued softly. "You don't use it up by giving it away. It grows with the giving. He said if anything ever happened to him, he'd want me to love again, because that would mean the love he taught me was strong enough to survive anything." "How do you know what the dead want?" Josiah wrote. "Because when you really love someone, you learn their heart. And Sarah's heart, from everything you've told me about her, was big enough to want you, to be happy, even if that happiness came from someone else." Josiah was quiet for so long that Ellie Mae began to think she'd pushed too hard, said too much. But then he picked up his pencil again and wrote just 4 words. "I miss her voice." "Tell me about it," Ellie Mae said. "Like music. Always humming, always singing. She made up songs about everything: washing dishes, feeding chickens, the way snow looked on the mountains. House was never quiet when she was alive. And when she died, you chose silence." He nodded, and she saw him make a connection he'd never made before. "You were trying to honor her by keeping the world as different as possible from what it was when she was in it," Ellie Mae said. "But maybe that's not what she would have wanted. Maybe she would have wanted you to fill the quiet with new music." Josiah looked at her for a long time, his dark eyes searching her face for something she hoped he would find. Finally, he wrote, "What if I forget her voice?" "You won't. It's part of you now, part of who you are, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for other voices too." He set down his pencil and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered peaks. When he turned back to her, some of the wildness had gone out of his eyes. "I'm sorry, I invaded your private place," she said. "If you want me to leave, I'll understand. But I need you to know that finding those graves didn't make me love you less. It made me love you more, because I finally understood how much courage it takes for you to let someone new into your world." Josiah picked up his pencil one more time and wrote very carefully, "Stay, please. I don't want to be alone with the ghosts anymore." That night, they sat by the fire in a different kind of quiet than before, not the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other, but the careful quiet of two people learning to trust again after nearly losing something precious. Finally, Josiah cleared his throat, and Ellie Mae looked up in surprise. He cleared it again, deliberately, and then so softly she almost missed it. He whispered, "Thank you." His voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakably human. unmistakably real. The first words he'd spoken in 16 years, offered to her like a gift she'd never expected to receive. "Thank you," she whispered back, and meant it more than any words she'd ever spoken. The sound of Josiah's voice, even whispered, changed everything between them. Over the following weeks, he began to speak more tentative words at first, his voice cracking like a boy's, then gradually stronger as he remembered how to shape thoughts into sounds. "Coffee's ready," he said one morning, and Ellie Mae felt her heart leap at the simple domesticity of it. "Thank you," she replied, and they shared a smile that acknowledged the miracle of ordinary conversation. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by years of disuse, but warm with an undertone that reminded her of pine smoke and honey. When he read aloud from his books in the evenings, haltingly at first, then, with growing confidence, she found herself closing her eyes just to listen to the cadence of his words. They fell into new rhythms. Morning conversations over coffee became longer, more complex. Evening discussions by the fire ranged from practical matters, where to set snares for rabbits, how to preserve the last of the garden vegetables, to deeper topics that surprised them both with their intimacy. "What do you miss most about the outside world?" he asked one snowy evening, his fingers busy with a new carving, a small bird this time, wings spread as if caught mid-flight. Ellie Mae considered the question, surprised to realize how little she actually missed. "Music," she said finally. "Church singing, mostly. The way voices sound when they come together, making something bigger than any one person could create alone." Josiah nodded, understanding. Sarah used to say that harmony was proof God existed. All those different notes, finding a way to fit together perfectly. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife without pain flickering across his face, and Ellie Mae felt something loosen in her chest. "What do you miss?" "Conversation," he said without hesitation. "The way ideas can grow when two people build on each other's thoughts. I've had 16 years of perfect agreement with myself. It gets boring after a while." They laughed together, and the sound filled the cabin with something it had been missing for too long: joy, simple and uncomplicated. But their growing happiness was interrupted by a letter that arrived with the weekly supply run from town. The writer who brought it was Tommy Hartwell, a boy of maybe 16 who worked for the general store, and his face was grave as he handed Josiah the envelope. "Mr. Brandt," Tommy said, using the formal address the townspeople had adopted for the silent mountain man. "Sheriff asked me to bring this up to you personal. Said it was important." Josiah opened the letter while Tommy waited, and Ellie Mae watched his face go pale as he read. When he finished, he looked up at her with eyes full of worry. "What is it?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "Man came to town asking questions," Josiah said, his voice tight. "Debt collector named Cobb. Sheriff says he has legal papers, a warrant to search for a woman named Ellie Mae Bishop. Wanted to know if anyone had seen her." Tommy shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "Sheriff told him no, Mr. Brandt. Said nobody'd seen hide nor hair of anyone matching that description. But this Cobb fellow, he's not the kind to take no for an answer. He's been asking around, offering money for information." Ellie Mae felt ice form in her stomach. She'd been so happy, so comfortable in their mountain sanctuary, that she'd almost forgotten about the danger that had driven her here. Now it was crashing back like an avalanche, threatening to bury everything they'd built together. "What else did the sheriff say?" Josiah asked. "Said to tell you this Cobb has 2 men with him, tough-looking types. They're staying at the hotel, but they've been riding around the valley, checking every cabin and homestead. Only a matter of time before they work their way up to the high country." After Tommy left, promising to bring word if anything else developed, Josiah and Ellie Mae sat in heavy silence. The letter lay on the table between them like a snake coiled to strike. "I have to leave," Ellie Mae said finally. "If they find me here, They'll arrest you for harboring a fugitive. I won't let that happen. No. Josiah's voice was firm, decisive. This is your home now. You belong here. Josiah, you don't understand. Arlen Cobb isn't just a debt collector. He's dangerous. He has connections with judges and sheriffs across 3 states. If he says I'm a criminal, people believe him. Then we'll prove you're not. She shook her head, tears starting to blur. Her vision. With what? I don't have papers, don't have witnesses, don't have anything but my word against his. And his word comes with money behind it. Josiah stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the peaks that had protected them both for so long. When? He turned back to her. His face held a determination she'd never seen before. How much do you owe him? The real amount, not what he's claiming. Thomas borrowed $300. We paid back about half before he died. So maybe $150, plus whatever interest he's charging. I have money, Josiah said, simply. Not much by town standards, but enough. 16 years of trapping and trading, with nothing to spend it on but supplies. We'll pay him off. Ellie Mae stared at him. You'd do that? Give up your savings for someone else's debt? Not someone else's, yours. And what's mine is yours now. The words hung between them, carrying weight far beyond their practical meaning. He was offering more than money. He was offering partnership, commitment, a future that included her in every decision. Josiah, she said softly, what are you saying? He walked back to the table and took her hands in his, those strong, gentle hands that had carved toys for a dead child and mended her broken boot and learned to speak again because she was worth the effort. I'm saying I love you, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the words. I'm saying I want you to stay, not just for the winter, but always. I'm saying if you'll have me, broken as I am, I'd like to make this official. Official? Marry me, Ellie Mae. Let me give you my name for real this time, legally and binding. Let me stand between you and anyone who wants to hurt you. She looked into his eyes and saw her own future reflected there, quiet mornings and firelit evenings, shared work and shared dreams, the possibility of children who would grow up safe and loved in this mountain sanctuary. It was everything she'd never dared to hope for. Yes, she whispered, and then louder. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, their first real kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both of them were crying. We'll face whatever comes together, he said against her forehead. Together, she agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. But 40 miles down the mountain, Arlen Cobb was studying a map of the high country and making plans that would test their newfound commitment in ways neither of them could imagine. The morning Arlen Cobb arrived at their cabin, Josiah was teaching Ellie Mae to shoot. They'd been practicing with his old rifle for a week, ever since the letter from town, and she was finally starting to hit the tin cans he'd set up on the fence posts. Breathe in, hold it, squeeze gentle, he coached, standing behind her with his hand steadying her shoulders. Don't jerk the trigger, let it surprise you. The crack of the rifle echoed off the mountain walls, and another can went spinning into the snow. Ellie Mae lowered the gun with a grin of satisfaction. I think I'm getting the hang of this, she said. You're a natural, Josiah replied, and he meant it. She had steady hands and good instincts, qualities that might mean the difference between life and death. If Cobb found them before they could make it to town to settle the debt. That's when they heard the sound of horses, multiple riders coming, up the narrow trail that led to the cabin. Josiah's face went hard, and he took the rifle from Ellie Mae's hands with practiced efficiency. Inside, he said quietly. Now, but it was too late. 3 men on horseback emerged from the tree line, and the one in the lead was exactly what Ellie Mae had expected: tall, pale, with the kind of cold eyes that enjoyed other people's fear. Arlen Cobb looked like death, dressed in a good suit. and the two men flanking him had the scarred faces and easy violence of professional killers. "Well, well," Cobb called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow. "Looks like we found ourselves a cozy little hideaway. You must be the famous Josiah Brandt, the mountain man who don't talk to nobody." Josiah said nothing, but his grip on the rifle was steady, and Ellie Mae could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Distance, cover, odds. "And you," Cobb continued, his gaze shifting to Ellie Mae, "must be the lovely Mrs. Bishop, though I hear you've been calling yourself by a different name up here. Something about being dead, wasn't it? What do you want, Cobb?" Ellie Mae stepped forward, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "What I've always wanted, darling. Justice. You see, I've been doing some digging into your late husband's affairs, and what I found was mighty interesting." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather portfolio, opening it with theatrical precision. Turns out Thomas Bishop wasn't just a failed farmer who borrowed money for seed. He was part of a little enterprise that robbed the First National Bank of Topeka 3 years ago. Made off with $12,000, they did. Ellie Mae felt the world tilt around her. "That's impossible. Thomas never—" "Oh, but he did," Cobb interrupted, clearly enjoying himself. "Bank records show the money was taken by 4 men, including one Thomas Bishop of Sweetwater County, Kansas. Only 3 of them got caught, you see. Thomas was smart enough to disappear with his share before the law caught up with him." "You're lying," Ellie Mae said, but even as the words left her mouth, she was remembering things, the way Thomas had always seemed to have a little more money than their farm could account for, his nervousness whenever strangers came around, the haunted look he sometimes got when he thought she wasn't watching. "Am I?" Cobb pulled out a photograph, yellowed with age. "This here's from the Topeka Herald. Ran right after the robbery. Take a good look at that face." The photograph showed 4 men in a police lineup, and there, third from the left, was unmistakably Thomas. He looked younger, harder somehow, but it was definitely her husband's face staring back at her from the newsprint. "Thomas told the other boys he was going to Kansas to start a farm," Cobb continued. "Told them he'd found himself a wife who didn't ask too many questions about where money came from. Smart man, your husband. Lived quiet, stayed out of trouble. Never touched his share of the take." "His share?" Josiah spoke for the first time, his voice deadly quiet. $3,000, give or take. Hidden somewhere on that farm, or so the surviving members of his gang believed. When Thomas died, they figured his widow would know where it was hidden. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. "You're not a debt collector," Ellie Mae whispered. "Oh, but I am. Just not the kind you thought." Cobb smiled, and it was the ugliest thing Ellie Mae had ever seen. "See, I work for the bank. They hired me to track down that stolen money, and I've been following cold trails for 3 years. When Thomas Bishop turned up dead in Kansas, I figured that was the end of it. But then his widow disappeared right around the time I started asking questions, and I thought to myself, now why would an innocent woman run from perfectly reasonable inquiries about her husband's finances?" One of Cobb's men, a thick-set brute with a scar running from his ear to his jaw, shifted in his saddle and said, "Can we get on with this, Harlan? It's cold up here. Patience, Frank. I'm enjoying this." Cobb's attention returned to Ellie Mae. "You see, Mrs. Bishop, the bank wants their money back. And if you truly don't know where it is, well, there's still the matter of you being an accessory after the fact. Harboring stolen goods, evading justice, all sorts of charges that carry serious prison time." "She didn't know," Josiah said, and there was something in his voice that made all 3 men look at him more carefully. "Didn't know?" Cobb laughed. "Come now, Mr. Brandt. A woman lives with a man for 2 years, shares his bed, spends his money, and never once wonders where it all comes from? That's a hard story to swallow." "It's the truth," Ellie Mae said, finding her voice again. I thought. The money came from good harvests, from selling livestock. Thomas handled all the finances. I just looked the other way, Cobb finished. Well, looking the other way is a crime too, where I come from. The third man, younger than the others, but with eyes like chips of ice, spoke up. Boss, we could search the place. Maybe she brought some of it with her. Good thinking, Billy. Cobb nodded toward the cabin. Frank, you and Billy tear that place apart. Look for anything that might tell us where the money's hidden. I'll keep our host's company out here. But as Frank and Billy started to dismount, Josiah took a step forward, and something in his movement made both men freeze. Nobody goes in my house, Josiah said, and his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made smart men think twice. Cobb studied him with new interest. You know, Mr. Brandt, I've been wondering about you. 16 years alone on this mountain, never talking to nobody, keeping to yourself. That's a long time for a man to stay hidden. Makes a person wonder what you might be hiding from. I'm not hiding from anything. No, see, I did some checking on you too. Josiah Brandt, born in Pennsylvania, moved west in 1866. But here's the interesting part. There's no record of you before 1867. No birth certificate, no family records, no military service. For a man who lived openly in these parts for 20 years, you sure don't have much of a past. Ellie Mae felt ice form in her stomach. She looked at Josiah's profile, at the careful blankness that had suddenly settled over his features, and realized there were things about the man she loved that she'd never thought to question. Who are you really? Cobb pressed. And what did you do before you came to this mountain? Josiah was quiet for so long that Ellie Mae began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words changed everything she thought she knew about him. Captain Josiah Brandt, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, United States Army, scout and reconnaissance specialist. Served under Colonel Mackenzie in the campaign against the Comanche. Cobb's eyes lit up with predatory interest. A cavalry officer. Well, that explains the way you carry yourself. But it doesn't explain why a decorated war hero would disappear into the mountains for 16 years. The war ended, Josiah said. Simply, the Indian Wars ended for everybody, Captain. Most soldiers went home to their families, found work, got on with their lives. They didn't vanish into the wilderness like ghosts. So I'll ask you again, what are you running from? Josiah looked at Ellie Mae then, and she saw 16 years of secrets in his eyes. 16 years of a truth he'd never shared with anyone. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm not running from something, he said. I'm running from someone I used to be. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, changing everything about the dynamics in the snow-covered clearing. Cobb's predatory grin widened as he sensed weakness, while his two men straightened in their saddles, suddenly more alert. Now we're getting somewhere, Cobb said, swinging down from his horse with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence. A cavalry captain with secrets. This just keeps getting better. Josiah, Ellie Mae said quietly, but he held up a hand to silence her, his eyes never leaving Cobb's face. You want to know who I was? Josiah's voice carried a weight that made the mountains themselves seem to lean in and listen. I was a killer, a very good one. The Army called it pacification and securing the frontier, but what it really meant was hunting down families and destroying them because they wouldn't give up their land. Frank, the scarred man, snorted with dismissive laughter. Every soldier's got blood on his hands, old man. They'll make you special. But Billy, the younger gunman, was studying Josiah with more careful attention. Something in the way the mountain man held himself, in the stillness that seemed coiled like a spring, was setting off alarm bells in his head. Josiah continued as if Frank hadn't spoken. My specialty was tracking. I could follow a trail days, old across bare rock, find water in desert country, predict where a war party would camp 3 days before they got there. And when I found them, he paused, and Ellie Mae saw old pain flicker across his features. I was very good at making sure they never ran again. Ancient history, Cobb said, though his voice had lost some of its casual confidence. What matters now is the present. And in the present, you're harboring a fugitive and interfering with a legal investigation. Legal? Josiah laughed, and there was no humor in the sound. You're bounty hunters with fake badges, tracking a woman whose only crime was marrying the wrong man. Don't insult my intelligence by calling it legal. Cobb's mask of civility finally slipped, revealing the cold fury beneath. Doesn't matter what you call it, Captain. End result's the same. The woman comes with us, and you get to live out your hermit life in peace. Fight us, and things get messy for everybody. They're already messy, Josiah said, and Ellie Mae heard. Something in his voice that made her blood run cold, not fear, but anticipation. You made them messy the moment you rode up my mountain with guns and threats. 3 against 1, old man, Frank said, his hand dropping to rest casually on his pistol grip. Odds ain't exactly in your favor. No, Josiah agreed, and then he smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Ellie Mae had ever seen. They're not. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but Ellie Mae would remember it for the rest of her life in perfect, crystal clear detail. Josiah moved like lightning made flesh. The rifle in his hand suddenly pointed not at Cobb, but at Frank, who was in the middle of drawing his pistol. The crack of the rifle shot echoed off the mountains, and Frank pitched backward off his horse, his half-drawn gun spinning away into the snow. Before the echoes had faded, Josiah had worked the bolt and swung the rifle toward Billy, who was faster than Frank had been, but not fast enough. The second shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dumping him from his saddle with a cry of pain and rage. Cobb, to his credit, didn't freeze. He dove for cover behind his horse, clawing for his own weapon, but Josiah was already moving, using the split second of confusion to close the distance between them. Stay down, he barked at Ellie Mae, who had dropped to her knees behind the woodpile without being told. The fight that followed was brief and vicious. Cobb was younger, desperate, and fighting for his life. But Josiah had 20 years of military training and 16 years of mountain living behind him, and he fought with the cold efficiency of a man who'd done this dance too many times to count. When it was over, all 3 bounty hunters were down. Frank was dead, his eyes staring sightlessly at the gray sky. Billy was wounded but alive, clutching his shoulder and cursing in a steady stream. Cobb was unconscious, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead where Josiah's rifle butt had connected. Jesus Christ, Billy gasped, staring up at Josiah with a mixture of pain and awe. What the hell are you? A man who's been left alone too long, Josiah replied, checking the bonds he'd used to tie Billy's hands. And a man who doesn't. Like people threatening his family. Family. The word hit Ellie Mae like a physical blow. Not because it was wrong, but because it was so completely, utterly right. She looked at this man who'd just fought 3 armed killers to protect her. This man who'd revealed deadly secrets from his past because she needed to understand what he was capable of, and felt her heart swell with a love so fierce it took her breath away. Are you hurt? She asked, running her hands over his arms and chest, checking for wounds. I'm fine, he said, catching her hands and holding them steady. But we're not out of this yet. They'll have told people where they were going, probably have backup waiting in town. We need to move fast. Move where? Josiah looked toward the peaks, where storm clouds were already gathering for what promised to be a brutal night storm. Higher up. There's an old mining cabin about 6 miles north, built into the rocks where it can't be seen from below. We can hole up there until we figure out our next move. What about them? Ellie Mae nodded toward the 2 living bounty hunters. Billy's hurt bad enough. that he won't be going anywhere for a while. Cobb. Josiah studied the unconscious man with the dispassionate gaze of a professional soldier. He's tougher than he looks. He'll survive, but it'll be hours before he's in any shape to cause trouble. They spent the next 30 minutes in frantic preparation. Josiah moved through the cabin like a man who drilled this scenario in his mind 100 times, gathering supplies with military precision. Food, medical supplies, ammunition, blankets, the tools and equipment they'd need to survive in the high country during a winter storm. From a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, he retrieved items Ellie Mae had never seen before: a cavalry saber wrapped in oiled cloth, a pair of military-issue Colt revolvers, and a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. "Your savings?" she asked. "Blood money," he said grimly. "Payment for services I wish I'd never rendered. But it'll buy us a new start somewhere far from here if we live long enough to spend it." As they loaded the pack horses, Ellie Mae found herself looking back at the cabin that had been their sanctuary, their home, the place where they'd found each other and fallen in love. Everything that mattered to her was in these mountains: their memories, their hopes, their carefully built life together. "We'll come back," Josiah said, reading her thoughts. "When this is over, when it's safe, we'll come back and rebuild." "Will it ever be safe?" He was quiet for a long moment, checking the loads on his weapons with the automatic movements of long practice. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I know this: whatever comes next, we face it together. That's what you do when you love someone. You don't run, you don't hide, you don't give up. You stand and fight for what matters." The first snowflakes were beginning to fall as they led their horses into the forest, following a trail so faint it was barely more than a suggestion among the trees. Behind them, the cabin sat empty and violated, its windows dark, its warmth already fading dull. But ahead of them lay the high country, wild and unforgiving and beautiful, where a man and woman could disappear completely if they were tough enough and smart enough and loved each other more than they feared the cold. "Tell me about this mining cabin," Ellie Mae said as they climbed higher into the gathering storm. "Built by a prospector named Henderson. Must be 10 years ago now. He was looking for silver in the high granite. Never found enough to make it worth his while. Abandoned the claim when the first big winter storm nearly killed him." Josiah paused to help her navigate a tricky section of trail where ice had formed over running water. But he built it solid, dug it right into the rock face, invisible from more than 50 yards away, and defensible if it comes to that. "Do you think it will come to that?" "I think Harlan Cobb is the kind of man who doesn't give up easy. And I think there's more to this than just stolen bank money. Men like that don't track one woman across 3 states for $3,000. There's something else, something we don't know about yet." They climbed in silence for a while, the snow falling harder now, covering their tracks almost as fast as they could make them. Ellie Mae found herself thinking about the man walking beside her, about all the things she'd learned about him in the space of an hour. "The war," she said finally. "Do you want to tell me about it?" Josiah was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were talking about someone else entirely. "I was 19 when I enlisted. Thought I was going to be a hero. Thought I was serving my country and protecting innocent people. Took me 3 years to understand that what we were really doing was genocide dressed up in fancy words." "What changed your mind?" "A village called Bear Creek. Women, children, old people who'd never hurt anyone in their lives. My orders were to neutralize hostile elements. What that meant was slaughter. And I did it, Ellie Mae. I followed orders and did what I was told. And when it was over, I looked around at what we'd done and realized I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was just a killer." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "That's why you came to the mountains. I tried to resign, But the army wasn't done with me yet. They had plans, more campaigns, more pacification. So I did the only thing I could think of. I disappeared. Changed my name, buried my past, tried to become someone who could live with what I'd done. And Sarah saved me. She looked at this broken, angry man and saw something worth loving. She never asked about my past, never pushed for details. I wasn't ready to share. She just loved me, completely and without conditions, until I remembered how to be human again. The trail was getting steeper now, winding through stands of pine and aspen that creaked and groaned in the rising wind. Ellie Mae could feel the storm building around them, the kind of mountain blizzard that could bury a person in minutes if they weren't careful. And when she died? She asked softly. When she died, I thought God was punishing me for what I'd done in the war. Thought I didn't deserve happiness, didn't deserve love, didn't deserve anything but solitude and silence. So that's what I gave myself 16 years of penance for crimes I couldn't undo, until I showed up asking about empty beds. He stopped then, turning to face her in the swirling snow, his hands reaching up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. Until you showed up and reminded me that love isn't a reward for being good. It's a gift, freely given, and the only way to honor it is to pass it on. He kissed her then, soft and sweet despite the cold and the danger and the uncertain future ahead of them. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "We're gonna make it," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," he agreed. "We are." The storm hit them in earnest as they reached the hidden trail that led to Henderson's abandoned mining claim. But by then they were close enough to smell wood smoke from the cabin's chimney. Someone had been there before them, recently, and that someone had left a fire burning and supplies stocked. "Friends of yours?" Ellie Mae asked. Josiah studied the smoke, his experienced eyes reading signs she couldn't even see. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe we're walking into another trap." But they were too cold and too tired to have much choice. As they approached the cabin, weapons ready, Josiah called out in the traditional mountain greeting, "Hello, the house." The door opened, and a familiar figure stepped out into the snow. Tommy Hartwell, the young man who'd brought them the warning letter from town. "Mr. Brandt, thank God you made it. I've been waiting here for hours, keeping the fire going and watching the trail." "Tommy?" Ellie Mae stared at the boy in confusion. "What are you doing here?" "Bringing news," Tommy said grimly. "And it ain't good news, I'm afraid. That Cobb fellow you've been worried about, he's got friends coming, a lot of friends, and they'll be here by morning." Tommy's news was worse than they'd feared. As they huddled around the fire in Henderson's old mining cabin, the young man laid out the situation with the grim precision of someone who'd seen too much violence for his 16 years. Cobb weren't working alone like he claimed, Tommy said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that shook from more than cold. "Sheriff got word from the territorial marshal's office. Seems there's a whole network of these bounty hunters. Maybe 8 or 10 men, all tracking that bank money your husband stole, ma'am." Ellie Mae felt ice settle in her stomach. 8 or 10 men? Professional killers, every one of them. Word is they've been working this case for 3 years, splitting up to cover more ground. When Cobb sent word he'd found you, they all started heading this way. Josiah was cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, but Ellie Mae could see the calculations running behind his eyes. "How long do we have?" "They were gathering in Cedar Falls when I left, maybe 6 hours ago. But this storm's going to slow them down some. I'd guess they'll start up the mountain at first light, assuming they can find your trail." "They'll find it," Josiah said grimly. "Men like that don't track by accident. They'll have Indian scouts, maybe dogs. The snow will help hide our tracks, but not for long." Ellie Mae looked around the small cabin, taking in the thick stone walls, the narrow windows, the single door. That represented both their only exit and their greatest vulnerability. "This place is defensible, isn't it?" That's why you brought us here. Defensible against 3 or 4 men, maybe. Against 8 or 10? Josiah shook his head. We'd be trapped. They could just wait us out, starve us into surrender. Then we run, she said. Keep moving, stay ahead of them. Run where? Tommy asked. They'll have the whole territory covered by now. And winter's coming hard. You can feel it in the air. Get caught in the high country during a real blizzard. And running won't matter because you'll be dead of cold before they find you. Josiah stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. The storm was getting worse, and even with his mountain experience, he could see they were rapidly running out of options. There's one possibility, he said slowly, but it's dangerous as hell. More dangerous than staying here to fight 10 professional killers? Ellie Mae asked. Maybe. He turned back to face them, and she saw something in his expression that reminded her of the deadly calm he'd shown during the fight at the cabin. There's a pass about 2 miles north of here, leads down into the next valley. Narrow trail, barely wide enough for one horse, with a 1,000-foot drop on one side. Sounds charming, Tommy muttered. In good weather, it's treacherous. In a storm like this, it's suicide. But it's also the last place anyone would expect us to go. And if we could make it through, we'd come out in Colorado territory, outside their jurisdiction. Ellie Mae studied his face, reading the unspoken parts of his plan. You're not talking about all of us going, are you? Josiah's silence was answer enough. No, she said firmly. We stay together. That's what we decided. That's what we stick to. Ellie Mae, be reasonable. I can hold them here for a while. Give you and Tommy time to reach the pass. Once I'm across, you'll be dead, she interrupted. And I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that the man I love died because I was too cowardly to stand beside him. It's not about courage, it's about sense. You're not a soldier. You're not trained for this kind of fight. She stood up and walked to where he'd laid out his weapons, the rifle, but to rifle. The 2 cavalry pistols, boxes of ammunition arranged with military precision. Without hesitation, she picked up one of the revolvers, checking the cylinder with movements he'd taught her during their shooting lessons. Maybe not, she said. But I'm a woman who's tired of running. I'm a woman who's found something worth fighting for. And a woman who's not going to let the man she loves face this alone. Josiah stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant when he realized that arguing was useless. She'd made her choice, and nothing he could say would change her mind. Tommy, he said finally, you should go. Take one of the horses, head for town. Tell the sheriff what's happening up here. But the young man was already shaking his head. Can't do it, Mr. Brandt. My pa always said a man don't run when folks are depending on him. Besides, he added with a grin that was half boyish bravado and half genuine courage, I've been hunting in these mountains since I was 12. Know every trail, every hiding spot, every place a person could set up an ambush. This isn't a hunting trip, son. These men will kill you without thinking twice about it. Then I guess I better make sure they don't get the chance. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, wind howling through the trees like the voices of all the ghosts Josiah had tried to leave behind. But inside the small cabin, 3 people who'd found each other in the wilderness were making their peace with the possibility of dying together. All right, Josiah said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd led soldiers into hopeless battles and brought some of them home alive. If we're doing this, we do it right. Tommy, you know these mountains. Where would they most likely approach from? South Trail's the easiest, but it's also the most obvious. If I was them, I'd split up, send half the men up the south face to draw attention, while the rest circle around and come at you from the north. Good thinking. Josiah moved to a crude map he'd sketched on a piece of bark. That means we set up crossfire here and here, force them into a killing ground where their numbers won't help them. As they plan their defense, Ellie Mae found herself thinking about Sarah's wedding dress, still hanging in the cabin they'd abandoned. Before leaving, Josiah had taken it down and wrapped it around some old blankets, creating a decoy that might fool distant observers into thinking someone was still moving around inside. It was a small thing, using his dead wife's dress to help protect his living one, but somehow it felt like the final blessing, the last gift Sarah could give to the man she'd loved and lost. "They'll come at dawn," Josiah said with quiet certainty. "That's when men like this always attack early enough to have the whole day for hunting, late enough to see their targets clearly. Then we better get some rest while we can," Ellie Mae said, though she doubted any of them would actually sleep. As they settled in for what might be their last night together, she thought about all the paths that had led them to this moment: her husband's crimes, Josiah's guilt, the cruel mathematics of love and loss that had brought two broken people together just in time to face the end of the world. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Whatever came with the dawn, they would meet it together, and that was enough. Dawn came gray and cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night to leave a world transformed by snow. From their positions around Henderson's cabin, they could see for miles down the mountainside, and what they saw made Ellie Mae's blood run cold. Men, at least 8 of them, maybe more, working their way up the mountain in 2 groups, just as Tommy had predicted. Even at this distance, she could see they moved with military precision, using cover, communicating with hand signals, advancing with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. "Professional killers," Josiah said quietly, studying them through an old pair of field glasses. "Probably ex-soldiers, maybe some Pinkertons. They know what they're doing." "So do we," Ellie Mae replied, checking her pistol one more time. They'd spent the pre-dawn hours preparing their defense. Josiah positioned behind the cabin's stone chimney with his rifle, Tommy hidden in the rocks above with an old shotgun, and Ellie Mae inside the cabin with clear lines of sight through the windows. The plan was simple: let the attackers get close, then hit them from 3 directions at once. It was their only chance: surprise and superior position against overwhelming numbers and professional skill. "Remember," Josiah called softly to Tommy, "don't shoot until I do. And when this starts, don't stop shooting until it's over, or you're dead. These men won't give us a second chance." The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Ellie Mae found herself thinking about the strangest things: the way coffee tasted in the morning, the sound of Josiah's voice when he read to her by firelight, the feeling of his hands on her face when he'd proposed. If these were to be her last thoughts, at least they were beautiful ones. The attack, when it came, was swift and vicious. The first group, 4 men, advancing from the south, burst from the tree line with weapons blazing, laying down covering fire while they rushed the cabin. At the same moment, Josiah's rifle cracked from behind the chimney, and the lead attacker went down hard, his rifle spinning away into the snow. But they'd underestimated the second group. While the main assault drew their attention, 3 men had worked their way around to the north, just as Tommy had predicted. What they hadn't predicted was that one of them was carrying dynamite. The explosion shattered the morning quiet and blew a hole in the cabin's north wall big enough for a man to walk through. Ellie Mae was thrown to the floor, her ears ringing, dust and debris raining down around her. Through the smoke and confusion, she saw a figure silhouetted in the jagged opening. One of Cobb's men, she realized, his face a mask of cold purpose as he raised his pistol toward where she lay stunned. Time seemed to slow as she watched his finger tighten on the trigger. This was it, she thought with strange calm. This was how it ended. But then Josiah was there, appearing like an avenging angel through the smoke, the family Bible clutched in his left hand while his right held a cavalry saber that gleamed like silver fire. The Bible intercepted the bullet, meant for Ellie Mae's heart, the heavy leather binding and dense pages stopping the lead slug with a sound like thunder. The saber, swung with all the skill and fury of a man defending everything he loved, took the gunman across the chest in a spray of crimson that painted the snow-covered floor. "Stay down," Josiah shouted to her. Then he was moving again, the saber dancing in his hands like a living thing as he engaged two more attackers, who'd followed their partner through the breach. Outside, she could hear Tommy's shotgun booming again and again, and the answering crack of rifles as the battle raged across the mountainside. But her world had narrowed to the deadly ballet taking place in front of her, Josiah moving with lethal grace, the saber weaving patterns of death as he fought men half his age with twice his desperation. He was magnificent and terrible. This man she loved, like one of the heroes from the old stories, brought to life in blood and steel. But she could see he was tiring, see the cost of 16 years of mountain solitude wearing on muscles that remembered war but had grown soft with peace. When the fourth attacker came through the hole in the wall, Ellie Mae was ready for him. Her pistol bucked in her hand, the bullet taking him center mass and dropping him before he could bring his weapon to bear. She'd never killed anyone before, never even imagined she could, but watching this stranger trying to murder the man she loved had awakened something primal and fierce in her heart. "Behind you!" she screamed, seeing another figure moving in the smoke. Josiah spun, the saber coming up in a defensive arc that caught the fifth man's rifle barrel and sent the weapon flying. But the effort left him off balance, vulnerable, and she saw the attacker's knife sliding toward his ribs like a silver snake seeking his heart. Without thinking, she threw herself forward, her body slamming into the killer just as the blade found its mark. She felt the steel part her flesh, felt the burning cold of mortal injury, but her momentum carried them both into the wall where they collapsed in a tangle of limbs and blood. "Ellie Mae!" Josiah's voice seemed to come from very far away, though. She could see his face above her, streaked with smoke and grief and desperate love. "Did we win?" she whispered, tasting copper on her lips. He looked around the ruined cabin, at the bodies of their attackers, at Tommy's young face appearing in the breach with a grin of victory and relief. "We won," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "We won, my love. Now stay with me. Please, God, stay with me." But the world was growing dim around the edges, and Ellie Mae felt herself drifting toward a place where there was no pain, no fear, no sorrow, only the memory of a man's voice saying her name like a prayer, and the knowledge that she'd found something worth dying for. Spring came late to the high country that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it the kind of glory that makes a person understand why some souls choose to make their home on the peaks. The aspens were leafing out in tender green. The meadows were carpeted with wilders, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. Ellie Mae stood on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, watching Josiah work in the garden they'd planted together. The knife wound that had nearly killed her the previous winter had healed well, leaving only a thin white scar as a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. "The tomatoes are coming along nicely," she called to him, and he looked up with that smile that still made her heart skip like a schoolgirl's. "Sarah always said this was good soil for growing things," he replied, straightening up and wiping his hands on his pants. Guess she was right about that too. It had taken months for the legal complications to sort themselves out. The territorial marshal had eventually arrived to investigate the battle at Henderson's cabin, and what he'd found there had painted a clear picture of self-defense against a gang of criminal bounty hunters operating outside the law. The bank in Topeka, faced with the choice between pursuing a pregnant widow or writing off a 3-year-old loss, had quietly dropped all charges in exchange for the return of what little money Thomas had actually hidden, barely $800 found sewn into the lining of an old coat, Harlan Cobb and his surviving associates were serving time in territorial prison, their reputations as professional manhunters permanently destroyed by their failure to capture one mountain hermit and his pregnant wife. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. "You're thinking too hard again," Josiah said, climbing the porch steps to stand beside her. "I can practically hear the gears turning." "Just remembering," she said, leaning into his solid warmth. "Thinking about how different everything is now from a year ago." A year ago, she'd been Ellie Mae Bishop, a desperate widow running from debts she'd never incurred, with nowhere to go and no one to trust. Now she was Ellie Mae Brandt, married in a simple ceremony performed by the traveling preacher who visited Cedar Falls twice a year, carrying the child of a man who'd learned to speak again because she was worth the effort. "Regrets?" he asked, and she could hear the old uncertainty in his voice, the part of him that still couldn't quite believe this happiness was real. "Only one," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "I regret that it took so long for us to find each other." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of the promise of ordinary days stretching out ahead of them like a blessing. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small wooden carving. It was a horse, no bigger than her thumb, but every detail was perfect. The flowing mane, the proud arch of the neck, the sense of motion captured in stillness. "You finished it," she whispered, recognizing the piece he'd started carving for his unborn son all those years ago. "We finished it," he corrected. "You and me together." Seemed like the right time to complete it. She cradled the tiny horse in her palm, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the love that had gone into every careful cut and curve. "What should we do with it?" "I thought maybe we could save it," he said, his hand coming to rest over hers on her belly. "For someone who might need a toy to play with in a few months." The baby chose that moment to kick, a strong movement that made them both laugh with the joy of new life stirring. Ellie Mae looked around at the world they'd built together. Cabin restored and improved, the garden growing green and strong, the mountains standing eternal watch over their small patch of paradise. "Tell me about the future," she said, as she had so many evenings by the fire during the long winter months. "The future," Josiah said thoughtfully, "as a porch swing where we'll sit in the evenings, watching our children play in the meadow. It has Christmas mornings with too many presents and Sunday dinners with too much food. It has quiet conversations and shared laughter and the kind of love that grows stronger with every passing year. And voices," she added. "Lots of voices. The house will never be silent again." "Never silent again," he agreed. And she heard in his words the promise of a man who'd learned that some kinds of quiet were prison cells, while others were sanctuaries. That evening, as they sat by the fire reading a habit they'd maintained through the hardest times, Ellie Mae found herself thinking about all the paths that had led them to this moment. The grief that had driven Josiah to the mountains, the debt that had driven her to his door, the simple question about an empty bed that had changed everything. "Josiah," she said, looking up from her book. He glanced over from the botanical guide he'd been studying, preparing for their summer herb gathering expeditions. "Is your bed still empty?" He smiled, understanding the reference to that first night when she'd asked the question that cracked open 16 years of solitude. "No," he said, closing his book and reaching for her hand. "My bed is full. My heart is full. My life is full." "Good," she said, rising to her feet and pulling him toward the corner where their marriage bed waited, no longer a shrine to the past but a promise of the future. "Because I was hoping you might have room for one more." Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow. And inside their cabin, two people who'd found each other in the wilderness celebrated the miracle of second chances, of hearts that could heal, of love that was strong enough to survive anything the world could throw at it. Some losses cut so deep they steal your voice forever. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone comes along who gives it back to you, word by precious word, until you remember how to sing again. The mountain man had found his voice, and he would never be silent again.